This is actually my first time. This is my first time ever hosting a podcast or doing anything like that. So if you have feedback, I know I tried to jump in a couple times when you were talking, and I have to remember not to do that. But welcome to the third episode of the Michigan Sports Analytics Podcast. I'm your host, Jake Grossman. Let's get started. Today, we'll be talking about all things PFF. Our guest today is Weller Ross, who worked for multiple NFL teams and is now a senior data scientist at PFF. In this episode, our stat of the week is going to be PFF grades. We'll also hit on some recent news that seems to be coming out of the AFC East and the Jets and the Patriots. Finally, we're going to hit on our main topic discussion, where we're just going to be talking about the flurry of new stats introduced by PFF over the past few weeks. So, Weller, do you want to take a chance to just sort of introduce yourself, maybe give the audience a little bit of your background and in both sports analytics and just in general?
Yeah, absolutely. As you said, my name's Weller Ross. I work on the data science team at PFF on the we call it the B2B side, the business to business side. So we also have the consumer side that's more like public facing, and then on the B2B side, we primarily do work with teams and things like that. But yeah, my background, I got my undergrad at the University of Tennessee, and then went up to Canada for my master's. Got in touch with a professor up there named Dr. Kevin Mojon. Great guy, love him. And he specializes in sport analytics. So I wanted to chase that dream and went and studied under him for a couple of years while I got my master's, and then I worked at the Buffalo Bills for a year while I was working on my master's. And after that, got hired by the Texans to be their first in-house analytics person, which was kind of wild, right? Like, it's a double-edged sword. It's nice because you get to kind of like mold the role into like what you want it to be. There's no like preset expectations of well, the last guy did it like this sort of thing. But at the same time, right, like you're building it from the ground up. But it was fun. I got to work in all the different areas of the organization, but not on the business side. On the team side, got to work with the medical staff, training staff on injury prevention sort of stuff. Also got to work with the scouting staff, obviously doing stuff for free agency and the draft, and then during the season, certainly working with like the coaching staff and things like that to prepare for upcoming opponents and scouting tendencies and whatnot. So that was a lot of fun. And then when the opportunity came to work for PFF, having already been very familiar with PFF at that point, it was a great opportunity. And so here I am, basically.
No, that's awesome. That's all really great stuff. I was actually kind of wondering, like, in that sort of time from when you first entered the league, which was like, as you said, like certainly with the Bills, but definitely with and definitely also with the Texans, like analytics, how did that sort of change in terms of that like culture of acceptance of analytics, like how receptive coaches and front office staff were to the, sort of insights you had to offer?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's been like an amazing transformation league wide, and it's been really cool getting to watch it, kind of have front row seats of seeing that progression. From, like you said, like when I was with the Bills and in grad school, it was not exactly super common for teams to even have in-house analytics people, and certainly not like people devoted to that role. And so getting to see it go from that to now you have teams with I don't even know how large some of the staffs are that some NFL teams have.
Dozens at this point, right? Like,
yeah. Like the Browns, Ravens, they're several teams that have very robust analytics staffs in-house. So that's really cool to see. I love it. And even not just like within the league or within football specifically, but there are more programs at universities now that offer either specific courses in like sport analytics, or some are offering, like sport analytics type majors and things like that. When I was working on my undergrad, I joke that I kind of tried to make my own degree because I majored in sport management, minored in statistics, did an independent study under a statistics professor so that I could tie the statistics stuff to the sports stuff. And like I said, I went up to Canada just to be able to study under a professor who specializes in sport analytics. So that was, just I want to pretend it's more recent than it actually was. It was about a decade ago, right? But still in just a decade, that's a huge transformation to see at various universities across the country that are offering, programs and support for people wanting to chase that career path.
Absolutely. Absolutely. All right. So we're going to now pivot into our stat of the week this week. We're going to be talking about PFF grades. Whether I found it, I almost enjoyed the idea of doing stat of the week and it's a grade, just because of that whole conversation. Because, PFF grades have really always come with controversy, first like created by Neil Hornsby back then in his basement. They've become like, I think overshadowed at some point, like throughout the time since they first showed up by like the diverse array of statistics that you guys offer. And it's sort of the theme of today's pod. But I think part of this is also just the role that the grades played on like Sunday Night Football. Like they really caught attention. And like when they were switched, like, from that plus minus system to sort of also look like Madden ratings, I feel like that also sort of like created this easy, intuitive thing for the fans. I think that came from Collinsworth's kids. But it's like not always like best to listen to like the screaming masses sometimes, but like there are like a couple of valid criticisms around the subjective nature of the grades, I think. Like I believe this kind of undersells the rigor with which the grades are formed. But like, Matthew Collar, I remember like his great book on PFF, Football's a Numbers Game. Like he said, there's like a 300-page handbook. He said there's detailed cross-checking. Like this process has gone through like several iterations as coaches have like, said, oh no, this doesn't work. You need to talk about this way. And then I think the last thing I'll say before I start asking you questions about it is I remember there was like a great quote from Dr. Eric Eager that was just like subjectivity isn't necessarily a bad thing if you can show it's predictive. And I feel like PFF grades have kind of really I feel like that's a great sort of summary of their value because while you can, nitpick over the subjectivity or whether something should have been graded a certain way or whether something should have been charted a certain way rather, I think there's still like a lot of, the predictiveness at the end of the day tells the story of how useful is this stat. So I guess for our listeners who haven't read Matthew's great book, can you explain a little bit about how the grading process works?
Yeah, absolutely. And I'll start from that plus minus system, right, that you mentioned, because I fans and the general public are becoming more and more familiar with the PFF grades and the system behind it. But I still think a lot of people out there don't even realize that the plus minus system exists and that's the foundation of it all. And so it's from a -2 to +2 and 0.5 increment system, and it is a very, very rigorous process that it goes through. There's checks and balances in place, and another thing that a lot of people either don't know or forget sometimes maybe is that we do have former like coaches and players that are on staff and in-house, and then sometimes some are call it like a visiting role sort of thing, and advise on things that they would look at differently. And we're also open to feedback immediately from players and coaches. I know that coaches will email in and say, hey, look, like why did my player get this grade on this play? Like that's what we assigned him to do in that role and in that circumstance, whatever. And the graders will go back and review those plays, and sometimes they will change them. Go, oh, like you have to be willing to admit when you're wrong, right? So we will change the grade sometimes, but also there are times where we'll stick to our guns and go, no, look, like this is how we set up our grading scale, and I see what you're saying, kind of thing, but we're not going to change it under this circumstance because X, Y, and Z reason, right? So there are those the give and take with the coaches and sometimes players. I've even heard stories of players reaching out like through direct messages on like Instagram or Twitter or wherever, right? So like I know that those back and forth exist, and we're we're certainly open to them. And even beyond those, right? Like we're at the combine every year, meeting with essentially every NFL team, and getting feedback and input. And, it's not all surrounding the grades, obviously, but there are sometimes questions regarding the grades, and we try to address those and obviously do the best we can. And so the way that translates up to like you're saying, the Madden style grades, the 0 to 100 grades, is also a very extensive aggregation process, I guess is the best way to put it. And that had happened. That whole process was developed before I was at PFF, but I have been like walked through it a little bit. I can't claim to know every all the nuts and bolts, right? But it is a very thorough process, and also a much more difficult task than I had even considered it being, even as somebody with like a team, because of the kind of parameters that they were working within when trying to convert those plus minus grades on the play level to 0 to 100 grades. They need to be you have to be able to aggregate them up over different sample sizes, right? So like people want like the game grades, and then they want like season level grades, and then sometimes like career, or like certain sections of career, or sometimes it's situational stuff. Like I just want to look on third down, right? Or just against cover 3, whatever it may be. And so like you get all these different sample sizes, especially if you're comparing players. Even when you're using the same sort of like lens to look through, you're still getting different sample sizes for the different players, and you still want it to kind of shake out and make intuitive sense, right? And so it's a very difficult problem to tackle. And I think, all things considered, it's really well done. It's directionally very strong. So like if people want to squabble over if a guy with an 82 grade is actually better than a guy with an 81 grade, that's probably a fair debate to have, right? Like, but directionally, on the whole, it's a very strong number, especially trying to take into account all the different facets and roll them into a single number, which is it's just kind of a mind-boggling thing to try and do anyway. So yeah, like there's a lot of conversation, I guess, discourse around the 0 to 100 grades, but on to a certain degree, right? Like all publicity is good publicity. If people are talking about it and arguing about it, then that shines more light on it, gets more attention for it, and I think that's a good thing, not just for PFF specifically, but also like I was gonna say football analytics, but maybe sport analytics as a whole, right? Just generating more discussion around it is a good thing.
For sure. I wanted to ask also, just like in the context of your work with NFL teams, like did that sort of impact your perspective on this at all?
Yeah, for sure. The big thing for me that opened my eyes to everything PFF does from my time working with teams that I wasn't aware of before that was how much data PFF collects and charts on essentially every play that isn't even like publicly available, right? So it's only offered to teams, and there's a huge amount of data and data points that are like only offered to B2B clients, and it's very, very extensive, and those processes, they all go through those same rigorously step-by-step things where you have the cross-checking of what's been charted on a play, and the timeline of it all, trying to get all that done. So it's it's an impressive system, that's for sure.
No, absolutely. I feel like one thing that I like at least stood out to me, like from your sort of recent stuff, and like in addition to all these sort of new stats, is you
Sure.
guys are also now publishing grades like in game and
Right.
immediately available after the game in a way that just, wasn't true until right now. So I don't know if that's exactly something you've been working on. I don't know, but I'd just be curious. Sort of what motivated it. Like, can you just talk about it a little bit? Because this is just sort of not a sea change, but it was interesting for sure.
Yeah, it's one of those things, right? Like it's I don't know, the nature of the beast a little bit, where not not even just within football, but certainly in this context, that we as like a society are used to just having information readily available at our fingertips, right? And so like, and we always have it right now. Like any question we want to ask, like we could Google it, right? And even now, it's you can ask ChatGPT instead, right? Like there's like things are always progressing on getting faster, more efficient, or better, right? And so football's no different. And PFF is, like you're saying, back to when it first started and they were first started getting teams as clients. They needed to start producing these grades and data points faster, right? And so uh, teams wanted them by certain day of the week or whatever. And then it's like, okay, well, we want them like the morning after the game. And so then we have different processes that cover different data points, and some of those are available the next morning. Some, depending on if it's NFL, FBS, FCS, will be a couple days out or whatever. And so it's this extensive thing, and PFF is always striving for that continuous improvement of becoming more efficient and finding ways to generate that data more quickly and have it available faster. And so to a certain extent, it's just kind of the natural progression of getting it, I don't want to say live, but approaching live, right? Like at the limit approaching, right? And
Yeah.
so
If you're grading plays before they ever happen, we might start to have a problem. But yeah.
right, exactly. Yeah, so it's we're just getting closer and closer to that threshold of what can be done, and how quickly that turnaround time can be. And of course there's also the catalysts that make that more appealing to push for, with like the changes in the NCAA this year, with some of the technology rules on the sidelines, having in-game video available and things like that. It just trying to stay ahead of that curve of like, okay, like how far off does that mean we are from allowing teams to have, grades on the sideline, or other things like that. So, might as well start working toward it now rather than uh, reacting to it, right? Be
Absolutely.
proactive and reactive. Yeah.
No, absolutely. I feel like that all makes that definitely makes sense in sort of the now competitive industry of football data. Um, I feel like one of the other sort of critiques of PFF grades that I see around, and frankly, I kind of disagree with this one. Like, not that don't disagree with a lot of the critiques, but this one particularly I don't think is fair. But I think it's really around transparency in the grading process.
Mhm.
I feel like like there's like the example of like the highly publicized situation from a couple weeks ago where PFF didn't charge Lane Johnson with that pressure allowed when there was the premature snap, and he wasn't ready. And I thought that was a great reflection on PFF on their grading process, both in terms of the ability to contextualize the play and say, no, this actually isn't Lane Johnson. Like this isn't ultimately we're trying to be predictive here, and this isn't predictive of Lane Johnson's likelihood to give up another pressure because
Yep.
he's not likely to be not ready for the snap at that.
Mhm.
So I thought that was great. Do you feel like there's like any additional transparency that might like help with buy-in, or do you also kind of feel like PFF might be past the point where of like even trying to get buy-in because everyone's kind of picked their sides in this like analytics culture war, so to speak?
Yeah, it's a great question. I get that. It really is a great question, because it's not even just like when you really start to try and think about how to answer that, it's not just answering a question about like people's perception of PFF. It's almost like a question about like the philosophical question of like people's human nature, right? Like of okay, like these people that have already picked their side of like, oh, PFF grades are terrible. I don't trust them, right? And then they just like they've already made up their mind. They're not going to budge off of it. That's that's kind of nature of the beast again, right? There are always going to be people that feel that way, regardless of like how much transparency or how much fine tuning or even like a complete overhaul of the grades. Right? You're always going to have people that would still have issues, right? And so it's definitely a great question, and you know, on the whole, like it's kind of funny, like because I don't necessarily feel like we try to not be transparent with our grading process, but we certainly don't make it like readily available, I guess. Um, we are far more transparent with like teams, so we'll take them through the process in far more detail. But
Of course, and that's where the buy-in is a little bit more important if we're
right,
like if we're being real about the economics of running a business like PFF, but also just like frankly like having the teams be like being the client of the teams. Like I think or the teams as clients is like a huge, I think like sort of like first mover pole position for PFF that like, like so much of the infrastructure I'm sure has been like within these data analytics departments is built off of PFF like data in a lot of ways. I would assume that like would make it really hard to go and immediately switch to any other data provider anyway. So it's like one of those
right.
things also where it's like it has that advantage. And then like the buy-in from the teams, like I don't know, it strikes me as like it makes sense for that to be a PFF's focus in a lot of ways because it's almost could be downstream of that too, where or you think that if teams buy in, eventually the fans will buy in. But
Right.
but
Yeah.
that's not necessarily how it's gone, but it's interesting to
Right.
think about.
It is interesting that like trickle down effect of right, like I think the biggest selling point to fans is that all 32 NFL teams, every FBS team, right, like a bunch of FCS teams are all clients, all the CFL teams, right? So like on one hand, it's like, hey, if they all trust us, then like, you know, uh,
But where's
you
your
can start taking a
confidence
factor,
coming from to start doubting the process? But yeah, no,
right?
I think that would be my the version of it that I would say as someone who doesn't work for PFF and can be a little more condescending. Um, but no, I guess like ultimately at the end of the day, like, what do you think is like the best way to like look at and use these grades? Like, do you think like it's like sort of a piece as part of the larger puzzle? Do you think it's something that just like, sort of like a first place where you start and then you contextualize further from there? Like, how would you sort of think about it? Or could you just say like, I don't really worry about the grades. The stats kind of tell the whole picture on their own, and the grades are just sort of this nice catch-all that's good for, an average casual fan, but maybe not so helpful once I'm actually trying to figure out what's really going on in the games.
Yeah, it's probably a good mix of all of that, right? Really, because like I said, directionally they're very good. If you're trying to compare two specific players and one has a slightly higher grade than the other, then obviously, even if I was going to sit here and say like, oh yes, of course it's right, the higher grade's better, like you're still going to want to dive more into the context anyway, right? Like, okay, like in what situations like caused him to have that higher grade? Like, okay, so maybe I work for a team that those situations we don't like use those concepts as often, right? And so we want this player that does have the lower grade because in those facets that we do, utilize more or whatever, we see that him fitting into that role, he has higher grades there. And so yeah, like it's a good like starting point. Like so even now or when I was working with a team and I'd be looking stuff up, it's a good almost like sanity check, right? Like it's like, okay, if I apply X, Y, and Z filters and look at things through this lens at this angle, like is there like a red flag here of like, oh, okay, like I have found somewhere that our upcoming opponent's quarterback struggles in this situation. Like again, I'm going to go dive into that context further, but because like I've said however many times now, they're directionally good, right? Like that'll jump out at me and go, okay, I think I've found something here. And so that's one of the things that I think they're really useful for is
Streamline
finding
that
a
process.
direction. Yeah,
Yeah.
streamlines the process for sure.
Yeah. No, that makes sense. And like I feel like that on its own is value, but
Mm.
yeah,
Yeah, and it's one of those things, right? Like you're saying, like like you mentioned with the Lane Johnson thing, right? Like they're like, do you want the grades to be predictive? Do you want them to be descriptive, right? Like, because there are different things, right, that we could adjust for or try to chase in one direction or the other, but it's going to be at the cost of the other side of the coin, right? So it's like, oh, if we want the grades to be really predictive, then like we would have to discount certain things that are actually of value in winning a game, but they're not easily like they're not stable, right? They're not uh, like something that can be replicated with reasonable expectation. And so you don't want to discount the player for doing that because they did it and therefore they should be credited for it. But like if you want the grades to be predictive, then like all of a sudden that's, swinging things, skewing things in one direction or the other. So it's definitely an interesting balance on all of that.
for sure. And I feel like I like when you said that, like, oh, I have like 15 different situations where I could think of that. I'm like, oh yeah, that's like an example of a player doing something well, but like that's not going to tell me how well the player is going to do well next game. And frankly, like to the extent that that's like there are players with like there are individual base rates for things like certain players will like do a little bit better. Like they don't have like not everyone is the exact same base rate, but like generally speaking, unless you're talking about like a guy with like a very specific thing where we sort of have a track record to then say, no, this base rate that isn't necessarily like that's higher than normal is stable. And then you're sort of just backing yourself into the same thing.
Right.
Okay, we're okay with it because it's stable just in a different way. So
Exactly.
yeah, I'm just thinking about like Debo Samuel Yak or something where it's like, okay, yeah, we know he's going to be able to do that because like that he can do that. That's like
Right.
that's his value in a lot of ways. So you don't want to like completely discount it, but you have to find the right way to contextualize it. Um, no, that's awesome. I think we're going to pivot into just some recent news now. I feel like I could talk about PFF grades forever, and sort of break
Yeah,
that.
I was going to make the joke earlier. It's like you could probably not even just a single podcast episode, but there could probably be an entire like podcast series like devoted to like the PFF grading process. Yeah.
Absolutely, absolutely, and that's I'll keep that idea in the back burner. But I was wondering, like, I don't know what you thought on the Jets firing Robert Saleh. Like, this is mid-season firing. First one of the season always jars everyone. It's always jarring for everyone. And it happened really early. Like, do you think this is like the kind of thing that can sometimes make sense with mid-season firings? And like, do you think there's like a specific ideal candidate to replace him?
Both are interesting questions, right? Like, is it too early in the season to be, pulling the trigger on firing a coach? One school of thought would be like, yeah, it probably is too early because we're only like a few weeks into the season, right? Like, but there's a school of thought of, okay, like if you go ahead and like make that hard cutoff now and make that decision, then that gives you more time for the process of finding the next best candidate to fill that role. And that, that could be a certain advantage to teams that wait till the end of the year and then they're, firing their coach while like the hiring process is going on. And then you gotta, almost sprint through that coaching carousel process rather than having the time to build up to it. And so, I'm obviously not in the Jets front office, so I can't say exactly what all the things were that they took into account before making that decision. But it did seem a little quick to me. I was surprised by it. I'll say that I wasn't expecting it to happen right that early. But who knows? And then I guess that kind of leads naturally into your question of like who could replace him. And that's probably a more interesting question. I've seen all sorts of stuff out there with plenty of names thrown around. I've seen Bill Belichick's name mentioned, and I've seen like Kirby Smart's name mentioned, I guess, as somebody they could possibly chase. Who knows? Vrabel's a good one. I overlapped with him with the Texans. He's obviously a very great football mind. And there are some others as well. Some younger coaches that I've heard are on the radar, like Bobby Slowick. I did not overlap with him with the Texans, but he is a PFF guy, a former.
I was going to say, or a
guy.
PFF. Yeah.
Yeah. So I managed to not overlap with him on either side, but it'd be cool to see him get a head coaching gig. And then a name like Joe Brady. I've seen that name in the mix as well. I think that could be an interesting one. He was a real hot name there a few years ago. So who knows, right? It'd be
I think
interesting.
they interviewed him, if I can remember correctly, for the head coaching job when it was Salah's, like when they were hiring Salah. I think he got an interview because it was that cycle.
Right.
No, yeah, I think it's one of those things where teams, I feel like when they sort of like, if they don't do well with one of those like hard-nosed defensive guys, they flip to like the young, sexy offensive coordinator, and then they like that doesn't work because it blows up for some reason. They pivot back and they're like, no, we need someone who's like a real football guy. It's like they go back and forth on that sort of thing. Just when it's like, I don't think either one is sort of a secret sauce, really. Although I probably
Right.
lean a little bit more towards offense, in terms of like who I would hire as a head coach. But like, frankly, that's like, I think a matter of preference. But yeah, no, I think it's like a super interesting question. I wonder if Woody just like was with his like all of his friends back from when he was like an ambassador in the UK, and they were like, "Man, what's up with your team? You got to sack the coach." Or sack the manager, whatever they call it over there. And like he's like, oh yeah, I don't know. Like they're like, he's been there 5 years. You guys have had no success. Like he's like, all right, fine, fine, fine. Like I feel like it was just something as stupid as that. Mostly because I've been a Jets fan my whole life and have seen stupider. But yeah, speaking to, I think speaking of the Jets, let's pivot to a more successful franchise in the AFC East, the Patriots.
Right.
They got Drake May starting now, pending injury. We might have to see how that one shakes out. But yeah, what do you think of that decision to sort of, bench him for the first few weeks of the season, still give him some decent amount of reps in practice, and then sort of put him out there against the Texans last week? Like, did you think there was a different way they could have handled it? Did you think this was optimal?
It's one of those things again, going back to the different schools of thought. And it's kind of interesting. The quarterback that they were starting the year with, Joe Milton, right? That kind of ties our schools together of, with me being a Tennessee alum and him being Michigan before that. Right. But it's one of those things where, I know, again, like now my Tennessee alma mater here, Peyton Manning's always said that he thinks it's best to start the guys out of the gate, let them learn under fire and take their lumps and go from there. And by no means would I ever claim to have better insight into that sort of process than Peyton Manning does. But I could certainly see the argument on the other side of like, there's value to easing into the NFL, right? Like it's a different level of competition than college. And if you have a young guy come in and like Peyton Manning setting the league record for interceptions in a season as a rookie, that like, that could weigh on different players differently, right? And some might be able to, overcome that psychological adversity, I guess, and bounce back from it and have a Hall of Fame career like Peyton Manning, or they might not. Who knows? Maybe it could have been a guy that goes through those early career struggles and isn't able to bounce back from it. And who knows? Maybe that's just because that guy wasn't as good in the first place, or maybe if he would have sat for a year, half a season, and then learned the system better, right? Like it's one of those damned if you do, damned if you don't, because people looking at Patrick Mahomes, right? People criticize that, like, well, why didn't they just go ahead and start him as a rookie? It's like, well, we have no way of knowing, right? Like, would he
Unfalsifiable, yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Like, would he have struggled as a rookie and not, been Patrick Mahomes, right? Like, so it's I don't know what the optimal choice there is. It's hard enough to project, college to pro for quarterbacks specifically anyway, really any position, but especially quarterbacks. There's there's just so many factors that play into it. And not the least of which is the situation they're put into, right? Like the team that they have around them. And so on top of that, trying to then predict, like, would they be better off, like going from college to pro as a first year or game one starter, I should say, or versus, mid-season starter or year two starter. Like,
Yeah, and
so,
then the taking an extra year in college aspect of it all, like at that point, if they're going to sit the first year in the NFL, should they have just played another year against, that sort of level of competition? I think is like sort of an interesting question. But I remember like I think there was some research on this back from like March, Eric Eager again, just like at Sumer Sports, where like I think he was looking at like that idea of like, is there sort of any statistical evidence for helping a first round quarterback? And like frankly, the sample size isn't really there to like
right.
evaluate that question, which I think he was very willing to admit, but I did think it was like there wasn't really evidence like, oh, like the first rounders who sit are better off. And it felt like teams were actually taking like it felt like teams were showing that they're like they had information on this. Like they were generally making kind of the right decisions, like as to whether or not to start or bench a guy, depending. So it was hard to like, not that that's something you can really falsify or like say. So it's like hard to know. It's a super interesting question as to how rest
Yeah.
affect quarterbacks, and I think as we're both getting at, it's like an incredibly idiosyncratic one. But generally, I think because of that uncertainty, if you don't know if it's better or worse, and you do know the advantages of the current collective bargaining agreement and how they impact rookie contract values for quarterbacks in terms of that incredible surplus value, I think you can convince me, hey, throw him out there because we don't know what helps, and we do know there's value if he's good, and we'll just be getting more of that value. And I think that's sort
Yeah,
of fallen down on this argument, but I think I could like, I don't think I feel so strongly that I couldn't be convinced in the right context. Hey, this might not be the right time to play the rookie quarterback. This situation is just really horrible. He isn't ready. He needs more time to adjust to the speed of the NFL, even like learn some NFL concepts because of like maybe he was in like a really college type offense that didn't have like a very many pro concepts in there. So I think it's one of those things you got to be like really flexible about, but there's certainly some
Mhm.
really interesting arguments both ways. Yeah.
Yeah, and then there's always, the circumstances where uh maybe they would have preferred to sit a guy for a year and let him learn, but either there wasn't a veteran quarterback available for them to start instead, or the starter they're planning on having, goes down with injury or whatever it is, right? Like, and all of a sudden the decision is made for you. Like, so your hands are tied at that
Absolutely.
point.
We're implying
Is
agency where it might not really exist.
yeah,
At least in
right.
every instance, for sure.
Yeah, yeah,
Um, no, for sure. Although I think you could probably go back in that one and say, well, if you didn't plan on starting him and you did your scouting process back in May or back in April and March, and you didn't bring in another competent quarterback, but I guess that's one of those
right.
things where it's like, well, we brought in one. What do you want us to do? Like,
Right, right.
yeah,
Yeah, and like, and then that, like, leads to the question of kind of like roster building in general, right? Like, is it best to try and get that franchise quarterback and then build around him, or is it better to try and like build a team with a uh we'll say a serviceable like veteran in place, and then wait for that franchise quarterback to be maybe not the final piece, but one of the final pieces so that they are walking into a good situation, right? Like they already have like a reliable offensive line in front of them. They have some good skill players around them rather than, uh, building from the ground up around a quarterback. Because then not only are they going to have struggles due to being a rookie, right? But also typically when you have one of those high draft picks, there's a reason that you're drafting that high. And so then you don't have the pieces around him to support him. And it's a very interesting dynamic and sort of a chicken or the egg sort of thing. It's like, is he struggling because of the situation he's in, or yeah.
No, absolutely. And I feel like if Trey Lance was Brock Purdy, like if Trey Lance was the one having Brock Purdy's success,
Right.
then I think a lot more people would talk about that path because that is what the 49ers did in a lot of ways. They just they hit on the wrong QB, so no one wants to talk about it.
Right.
Everyone's like, that was like the worst trade ever, but no one can really say anything because they also made like one of the best draft picks ever. So
Yeah.
it's like, damn it, like come on, we had him. Yeah, that's I don't know. I just find that one funny because I think that would sort of serve as the prototypical example. But now we have the Penix Cousins situation, so maybe that one can sort of prove as like a you don't even need to only have one quarterback on the roster at any one time, so you can
Mhm.
actually have the information of whether you have the next guy before you move on from the veteran, which is actually something that I'm somewhat convinced of. I do think the rookie quarterback contract value thing is like it sort of makes me pull away from that a little bit, especially when I think like your quarterback is like a sort of a ceiling capper like Kirk Cousins, where it's not like there's
Mhm.
enough uncertainty there, in my opinion, to convince myself that in the right system, the right scheme, that if everything just goes perfectly, that can be like, a team that wins you the Super Bowl. I'm not sure I'm convinced of that. Um,
Right.
I just frankly with Kirk Cousins, and I'm not sure that that doesn't like take away from the value of that move versus doing it with someone who I don't know. It's hard to say that when Jared Goff is like basically like made the Super Bowl once in the last 6 years, and then also almost pretty much made it. Like last year, like I mean, hey, like it took a lot to go wrong for Jared Goff not to have been in the Super Bowl. So it's like one of those things. I'm like, do I really think
Right.
Jared Goff is that different from Kirk Cousins? No. So like maybe I'm just being a little
Right.
too overconfident there. But yeah,
Yeah.
I got in my own
And
whirlwind
like,
there, in my own loop. I'm
no,
not
no,
sure
it's
anyone had a
it's
yeah.
a fascinating conversation, right? Because you're right. Like there are plenty of examples in history of, I mean, like the Ravens have somehow done it multiple times with quarterbacks that you wouldn't look at that quarterback in isolation and go, that's your Super Bowl winning quarterback right there. But they've found a way to do it like with a couple different quarterbacks and have a few Super Bowl rings because of it. So uh, there's
Joe Flacco
there's
might be
definitely
elite. He
a
may have
path
been
there.
wrong. I don't know what to say. We may have been wrong. He
Right.
might be elite. It
Right.
took until he was this old to like finally show it, or maybe just the way defenses are playing now. I don't know. Like it's just easier for him to attack specifically. Like
Yeah.
I think you could honestly make that argument to me, and I would actually be open to it. Is that like there is a like kind of just like the stuff that they're throwing at them. Like if you are like actually a really savvy quarterback, um, it's really helpful in today's NFL because of the complexity of defenses and how many quarterbacks are really struggling with even just like, I don't want to say simple stuff at the line because I could never do it, but simple stuff pre-snap and post-snap that or stuff that needs to be simple for an offense to function, rather, I think is the better way of
Right.
putting it. And it's
It's a
just
really good
not.
way to put it.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Like you said, it's not simple. Like those things are not simple, but you need them to be simple for your starting quarterback. Otherwise, the quarterback's going to struggle, and or your play caller is going to be handcuffed a little bit because uh, he can't do everything he wants to do in terms of scheme and whatnot. So it's yeah. I mean, there's another podcast idea for you, right? You could have just a whole like how do you build a franchise given your quarterback situation, right? Yeah, because
Absolutely. Honestly, a series, as you said before, because I feel like you could do a whole pod on each of the situations and where you go from there.
right.
Sort of speaking about that idea of I was sort of trying to like how good is this quarterback and sort of taking like looking at the simple stuff and versus this more complex stuff. I feel like that's like a nice transition into like the first stat that we're going to be talking about in our main topic discussion, which is QB ISO percentage. Could you tell us a little bit more about that? Just so like the audience sort of has the context before we maybe dive in a little bit deeper.
Yeah, it's an interesting concept, and uh, as I told you before start recording it kind of thing. These all these metrics, it's kind of a fascinating idea that PFF had coming into the season of just wanting to really lean into generating creative ideas. Right, we like I mentioned before, we have so much data, and we know that it's not being utilized in all the ways it could be, right? Like there are countless lenses you could look through and ways to twist the data and see it from this angle or that angle or whatever, right? And so it was kind of this internal challenge, so to speak, just a fun thing. Like, hey, who thinks they can come up with like the best metric? I don't want to say best, but like most interesting, whatever it is, right? Like it's just this like unofficial official kind of challenge that was thrown down across the company, right? Of like, hey, like let's see what we can come up with. And as you've mentioned, like there's apparently a lot that we can come up with. And so yeah, I guess I went on that little tangent there just to give the caveat of by no means am I an expert or even like any more knowledgeable than maybe like you are, right, on some of these. So it's one of those things, but the QB ISO percentage is really interesting. It's an interesting idea of trying to figure out when how well a quarterback performs and trying to hold the scheme constant, essentially, like take out the things that are designed to help what we were talking about before with like identifying coverages and things like that a quarterback needs to do pre-snap, and looking at like how well are they performing without play action or RPOs, motions, and things like that, and eliminating like the screens and quick game stuff to figure out like, all right, which quarterbacks when excluding all of those I don't want to say circumstantial, but all of those things that like could skew things, which quarterbacks are facing these situations the most, I guess. And it's certainly interesting to see, kind of how that list shakes out of which quarterbacks are put in those situations most.
Oh, for sure. There's some really interesting results. Like I was just looking at that again. Like I know, like I thought it was like, I wasn't necessarily surprising for me, but more of a confirmation. Like Brock Purdy was second lowest last year, but this year he's a little bit like towards the higher end. And like I was like, that tracks with what we've been seeing from watching him. Well, like Mahomes has been sort of at the bottom end because we kind of know that the Chiefs offense is a lot of these easy button stuff. That's not saying Mahomes isn't good.
Right.
And like I kind of like, and like I think I just noticed that Derek Carr appeared at the top of the list last year and is like towards the bottom this year. And it's like, okay, yeah, Pete Carmichael, come on. Like that tracks. So I wasn't surprised by that one, but I didn't look for it. And then I just kind of caught my attention when I was just looking at the results again. So I guess like, yeah, it was like, was there anything that you saw in terms of the results that was like most surprising to you?
Yeah, I mean, some of the things you pointed out, like especially like the Derek Carr one was interesting. Seeing that huge swing. And like kind of the what am I trying to say? Like the like spread of experience, right?
Yeah.
Like, and like how some of the young quarterbacks are at the top or bottom, and then some of the more experienced quarterbacks are at the top or bottom. And if I'd gone into it blind and somebody'd asked me like, hey, how do you expect this like distribution to shake out? I was like, I would have guessed that, okay, play callers are doing more of these things to help their young quarterbacks. And that hasn't necessarily been like completely true, right? It's more solely, it seems like more because of just how they call plays rather than because of the experience of the quarterback they have in.
Sort of, yeah. Like I feel like it's like also like not the largest sample size in the world.
Sure.
Like
Yeah.
you have like Bo Nix at the top, and like I think we kind of just have seen like Sean Payton's going to be really like they're running the least motion in the NFL now at this point. Like it's like he's running a lot of these like not as nearly as much easy button stuff as I think pretty much any other offense in the league once you combine Bryce and Dalton. So it's like okay, yeah, he's making things really, really hard on this rookie quarterback, but they're actually not doing the offense isn't that poor, frankly. It's not good, but it could be a lot worse with a rookie QB and sort of making things so hard on him. I just found that a little interesting. And then also kind of funny how just Bryce Young has basically led the metric. It's like they were not making things easy for Bryce Young. Like they're making things so much easier for Dalton. It's like I'm not saying give him another shot, but man, did they like not give him a chance there? Like even Baker, like last year with Canales, things were a lot easier. Like,
right, and it almost makes me wonder, like, okay, maybe my perception's wrong on what makes things easier for the quarterback pre-snap. Like,
right,
like I don't know, right? Like maybe there's something to that of like, oh, these quarterbacks, or maybe it differs from quarterback to quarterback, right? Like that makes sense too. It's like, okay, this guy, like him seeing, like they put a guy in motion and that helps him identify the coverage, blah, blah. But maybe for some guys that gives him like too much to think about pre-snap of like, okay, let him just like see what he sees, process that information, and then not figure out if he needs to change that information based on the motion, just, let everything stand as is. I wouldn't have guessed that again, but seeing these results, it gives you something to think about and, kind of question your own perceptions and potential like biases, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I was actually wondering, have you guys like, because this is sort of like a play context filter, like have you guys like looked at like using the filter like, oh, in QB ISO situations, like this is how like certain QBs are doing from an EPA perspective or from a raw grade perspective. Like I was just kind of curious about that because it seems like one of those things where it's like, oh, like we've now isolated the things that we think, and like granted, like we're just kind of through some doubt on that, but we've isolated the things that we think are like more within the QB's control, which are these sort of ISO plays.
Mhm.
And like looking at performance within those plays, I was wondering like, is that going to be really more stable maybe than like, even like the regular grades? Like, or is it like kind of thing I was just curious about? Yeah.
Yeah, no, and I have not looked at that.
Yeah.
I don't know. Maybe somebody else has, but I
Uh,
haven't. But I have thought about that a lot with looking through these new metrics in general of just like, oh, this would be interesting. Well, kind of like we talked about with the 0 to 100 grades, right? Like it's like, oh, this is really interesting. Now I'm curious about if like what is like their average depth of target, right? Like in these situations, or like maybe their average EPA or like positive EPA rate or whatever, right?
definitely. Yeah.
Like all these different things you could look at within this context that could shine more light on it, right? Like maybe some guys when they're in this like quote unquote ISO situation perform better, maybe some perform worse. I don't know, right? Like maybe just everybody across the league performs worse in those situations. I don't know.
Yeah. And I think it's like one of those things where it's not necessarily like while there's a trend, there's also guys who can buck the trend, right? They're like RQBs
Sure.
that can add more or less relative value in the non-ISO situations as well, just by being like hyper accurate and
Mhm.
like processing the like always being on time, like those kind of things that like while they're not gonna like they're a little bit like I would say like the subtler things of playing quarterback a little bit where it's like we're not like we're focused like big arm, run, escape sacks. Well, it's like there's all like the little things of just keeping the offense on time that like I feel like in a lot of ways because so much like we're seeing this like more than half the plays are being run in these like sort of like easy button scenarios, but it's not like everyone's doing like these rates aren't that different and these quarterbacks have very different results. So I
Mhm.
wouldn't just say it's like, oh, ISO situation. It's not really on the quarterback. Like, no, there's stuff the quarterback has to do well in these situations too.
Right.
They're getting
Yeah,
things that help them succeed.
absolutely. Absolutely. And it's fascinating, like, because there is that value in consistency, right? Like even if it's not performing great consistently, obviously there's value in that too. But like even if like just performing above average consistently, it like if you can do that for 17 games, right? Like that's huge. And actually that's a really cool thing that I think the 0 to 100 grades capture well is that if you are a player that is like, hypothetically, let's say you get a 72 grade every game for the entire season, your season grade is going to be much higher than that 72, right? It's not just like a math equation of averaging those things out because you get rewarded for that consistency, basically.
100%, 100%. So yeah, can you describe defensive impact plays over expected and like maybe how this metric came about, sort of what it's looking at? This one's a little more, we have an expected stat that's data science stuff. So I thought maybe there's a little bit of a data science role in this one.
Yeah, this one. So I did not have a hand in this one. I was trying to remember who threw this one into the ring. Failing to come up with it in the moment, but so I can't definitively say one way or the other whether or not it was somebody in data science. But yeah, that over expectation kind of makes you think that, and I like in the few sentence write up for this one, I believe it was, they said something about providing more context, right? Of like what are these things that they're doing? Because I believe they just did it based on position and snap count. So saying like this position typically gets this rate of impact plays, and
Oh,
this
I
player's
misunderstood position as as position on the field. Like it was using all the location data. Oh, okay. That's actually, thank you for contextualizing that for me because I did miss that piece.
Yeah, no, I again, I believe I'm right about that.
Yeah.
Somebody may
No, I
correct
think
me.
you are. I think I misread it.
But yeah, it is really interesting just thinking about this concept of like, okay, like who are the players that can exceed, yeah, I mean the expectation, even if it's just the expectation of like, I don't know, our subconscious expectation as fans, right? Like where we just think of like, okay, this guy's an edge rusher, and I think of edge rushers being able to like make this sort of impact on the game. This is kind of, I feel like, what this metric's capturing of like this guy's this guy's exceeding that or he's not, right? Um, and so I believe they define the impact plays as pressures, defensive stops, batted passes, forced incompletions, or interceptions. And so it's like, how much are they disrupting the game basically as a defensive player, which uh, is important. And I think it's one of those things that like you see this, and if you start out at like the roster position level, then a next step can be look at it based on uh, snap count within like play position, and then you can do like snap count within uh, like role in play position. So it's like, oh, okay, were you lined up as an edge but then dropped out of coverage versus pass rushing kind of thing. Like you could start trying to do all sorts of stuff to figure out how you want to define expectation, right? So
Absolutely. And I feel like people in the football world really don't like they don't like when things are referred to as positionless. So I avoid talking about that too much, but I do think the way defenses are playing now and the way they're sort of disguising their, coverages and blitzes sort of together and marrying the two, it's sort of led to like a lot of those like the front, like you'll see a random front seven guy drop. I feel like more than like I feel like I used to, and vice versa, where I feel like like you have the Josh Metellises of the world where like what position does that guy play? It's like like like
line
I
up
don't know, like
wherever you need him to line up, right?
right. So it's like it's one of those things where it's like, yeah, I feel like having that context of like, oh, where is the guy actually standing? And on this play, what's actually being asked of him instead of just what's ordinarily asked of him is like certainly the kind of thing that can like improve that stat. But even on its own with what it has, it is quantifying something that we really care about, which is what like is this guy adding impact? Like the theory of the stat absolutely sort of speaks to what we're looking for
Right.
in terms of just like evaluating a player. Because it's sort of getting at this idea that I think is really hard to know, which is what's actually this guy's role and what was he really like in a position to do on the field. Like I feel like when you get into those off-ball sort of positions, it becomes a lot harder to think about. Like I think especially like linebackers and safeties, I think would be the two that I would gravitate towards because their roles are much more malleable.
Yeah, absolutely. And like you're saying, like the off ball stuff, there's a bunch of different ways those guys can be used, and it can depend on the scheme, it can depend on the player, right? It can depend on the situation. So uh, there's obviously always more ways to like contextualize things and look at them. But yeah, it's definitely an interesting metric for sure.
Yeah, no, I think it's great. I might move on to another metric now because I do want to talk to you about obvious passing situation win rate, OPS. Love that we got a football OPS now.
Yeah.
But yeah, can we just maybe just briefly explain what it is first before we jump into it?
Yeah. So right, they're looking at the edge rushers pass rush win rate, I believe, at in obvious passing situations. And this is a great example of like uh there's so many of these where I'm like, oh, I'm curious about the other side of the coin too, right? Where it's like, well, now I want to know like who are the best guys in not obvious passing situations, right? Like, and then I also want to know like which like pass blockers are the best in each situation, right? Like is right? Like
Oh, absolutely.
there's so many ways to look at it. And this one, you have names at the top that you kind of expect to see at the top with like Aiden Hutchinson and Myles Garrett, right? Those guys certainly produce as pass rushers. So uh, this kind of confirms confirms that for sure. And it's nice to isolate obvious pass situations versus non-obvious, I guess, pass situations.
Yeah, I wonder if this is the kind of thing like, I wonder, yeah, I'm very curious about the stability of this one. I guess that's where I'm kind of like my brain's going. And this is just sort of like a data science oriented question. Because these stats are being tracked, and I see 2023 data. Is this the kind of thing that PFF could build in going back, or was it just something that wasn't being? I guess this isn't maybe the best example of it because obvious passing situation win rate, you just really needed to have pass rush win rate, and then you can just apply whatever you're defining as an OPS. But like, I
Right.
guess a lot of these stats in general, like, is the goal sort of to like add them in going backwards to the extent it's possible, or is it more just like from here on out, we're going to start talking about these things?
Potentially. I don't know if that
Yeah.
goal is or is not in existence, right?
Yeah.
Like I don't know if that was a plan coming into it. I don't know if maybe that's something that'll happen coming out of it, but that's certainly a possibility, right? I think most, if not all of these, certainly we have the data available to go back at least a few years uh, to generate these metrics historically. And as you alluded to earlier, or at least off air discussion. I don't remember if we've talked about it on air yet. But the idea of which of these are most stable and which ones maybe have the most at least correlation, probably not. I don't know, maybe causation with like success, like team success or player level success, that sort of thing. And that's something that is always in the cards, right? Like something I can say that the data science team has very much on our radar right now is putting a system in place for us to more easily, I'll say, measure the utility of various metrics, whether it's some of these, right, or some of the things that we come up with and use as kind of like validation and checks and balances, so that when we go meet with the teams at the combine and stuff, like we can say, hey, look, we have this new metric that we're providing for you guys, and here's how it stacks up against X, Y, and Z other metrics that are trying to capture the same thing or trying to evaluate the same position group or whatever it is, right? Like, so that is something we're working on, and yeah, it could very much be in the cards that we throw some of these metrics into that process when we finalize it.
Yeah, I think there's more of a data science question also, but like, I don't know. I was just kind of thinking about it to myself when looking at the stat. Like, I don't know. I feel like I read something. I think it was probably Michael Lopez about like using thresholds with continuous variables, and this would be like one of those things where it's like, do you think it'd be better to just like weight pass rush win rate based off the expected like PROE or something like, and then like sort of do it that way where you're not sort of cutting anything out and it's more of a composite. Like, I don't know. That was like something that occurred to me when I was thinking about it because I'm like, ooh, we're using a threshold with OPS. Like, why is it really that big of a deal that it's a 70% versus 69% or something like that? Depending on however OPS is defined. But like, I don't know. I guess I was thinking about that. Like, do you think like that's like a sort of like statistically like valid way to look at it? Or do you think it's more just like it's okay to sort of make these cutoffs when we're trying to like talk about certain situations and how blockers might, behave differently or vice versa?
Yeah, it's definitely an interesting conversation to be had, right? Like obviously, like statistically, as I guess I'll say quantitatively inclined people, right? Like we want to account for the different variables and try and hold things constant and build models around it uh, to capture whatever we're trying to capture, right? Like and gain that information. But a lot of times that's harder to put into an easily digestible format for a scout or a coach or whoever, right? Like or fans, right? And so if it's something you can put into something with hard cutoffs and thresholds of like, okay, we're going to show this and we're going to group these things together with this definition, right? Then you can have like a checkbox of like, yes, include this, yes, don't, right? Like, and that's a lot easier than like explaining, right? Like, yes, this model like accounts for all of these things and like holds these things constant, right? When isolating this, variable of interest. And so, yeah, it's definitely a balance of, right, I guess, like statistical rigor,
Right.
and like conveying it to, well, really just the general public, I guess.
No, statistical communication and statistical rigor, I don't know if they're not always in tension with one another, but I think it's reasonable to say sometimes they are. And you have to
Oh yeah,
adjust
for sure.
based on what will make it more easily understandable, depending on your audience, right? Whether you're
Yeah.
working with an audience of data scientists or not. So I think like now we might just like fly through some of the other PFF stats. They're very much grading based. So I think we could just sort of talk about them a little bit more collectively.
Yeah.
Uh,
Yeah.
yeah, like we have, I'll just sort of list them out for the audience and maybe just give like a brief one sentence just so that gets there. So we have like unassisted pass block success rate, which just looks at how often pass blockers win when they're left one-on-one with a pass rusher. And then we have chip percentage, which, it's when a blocker, it's like, usually running back or tight end, sort of briefly hits the edge rusher to disrupt them, a chip as we commonly understand it. And it just sort of just tracks the rate of that, right? I think, but depending on the pass rusher. And then you have double team rate, which feels like a different sort of chip percentage, and double team rate feel like they're, two sides of the same coin.
Yeah, I think they did specifically do chip rate for edge defenders specifically, and then double team for
Correct.
interior defense. Yeah, so I think that is part of the distinction there. But
And double team rate, I think, refers to is double team on pass plays as well? Yeah. Okay. Yeah, I just wanted to confirm that. Yeah, but it's one of those things where it's just really interesting.
it is very much two sides of the same coin. You're absolutely correct about that.
No, I'm not sure. I think double team could be run plays only. I feel like I need to look at that one more time. I know I was reading it closely, but that's it. That's just lost on me in the notes I took. Wasn't quite detailed enough for that one. But yeah, run defense snaps. Yeah, it's run defense only. So
Okay.
it's run defense versus pass defense. So it's one of those things where it's that is the distinction I would say between them, and in addition to different positions. Not that you couldn't maybe apply one to the other and vice versa. Not that you're really chipping an interior defender, but like
That'd be interesting. Yeah.
Yeah, no, I don't quite know how that would work, but I'm curious to see a team try. Dexter Lawrence giving you problems. I want to see a team give that a go. So double team rate and chip rate. We have block tackle rate, which is about linebackers and how well they perform and that one I thought was so interesting. You're just like, okay, what percentage of plays are they blocked? What percentage of plays do they make a tackle? Boom, block tackle rate. And I'm like, oh yeah, that is exactly what that is. So that one was really interesting. And then we have a few pass rush based things. So we have a spin move grade, a bull rush win rate. So sort of looking at the different ways of rushing the passer. Yeah. And then you have anchor rate, which is sort of the other side of the coin from bull rush win rate, which is just how an offensive lineman holds up against the bull rush.
Right.
That one's like very much that one is literally two sides of the same coin. But yeah. No, what are you gonna say?
I was just saying the spin move grade. I wish we had that going back to like Dwight Freeney. I hear spin move. I think Dwight Freeney immediately.
Yeah.
At least in the context of pass rusher, I guess like.
No, those old Peyton Manning teams. That's what I grew up on. So absolutely.
Love it. Yeah.
No, so I guess like maybe like I had like I think in terms of these sort of like metrics, like do you. Like I think like the first thing I'll start with is the chip one, because I was mistakenly under the impression that chips were like in some way counted as double teams prior to this. Like, do you know like if chips were always sort of being counted and just factored into a different number, or if this is just sort of the introduction of looking at chips to PFF?
I believe they are distinct. I will not.
Yeah, you don't want to. Don't worry about that.
Stake my reputation on that. But I believe they are charted in a way that they are distinct. Again, like you mentioned, there's documents of however many hundreds of pages, breaking down exactly what are graders and game charters, right? Like what they're doing and what rules they're following to chart all this data. So I could be wrong about that, but I think they are distinct.
Okay. The other question, like another question I thought was really like sort of interesting in relation to all these metrics was like, do you think there's like significant signal and like, I don't know, like we'll talk, like if we talk about like unassisted pass block success rate to be like signal and like the team's willingness to leave a guy one-on-one, or in the reverse, like if we think about like like signal about your own team versus signal about the other team, like how often teams choose to chip the other team's defender or double team them or, or like make sure that like, like they're blocked. Like, is there something there where like a guy might be more likely to be blocked because the defense is making sure that that guy is blocked, like, or having
Right.
two guys on him? So it's like I think with all these stats, you can sort of say there's some signal in the volume of it just as much as there's signal in the performance, right?
For sure. Absolutely. Like you're saying, it's a preventative measure from the other team's perspective, right? Like if they're chipping a guy, it the volume is important. Like knowing that the guy is
DJ's
warranting
chipped
that
at a
much.
crazy rate. Yeah.
Right, right. Like if he's earning that much attention, there's something there, right? Like even if it wasn't a guy as obvious as TJ Watt, right? Like you know,
John Cooper.
yeah. Like then it's reasonable to think that the teams that are preparing to play him are seeing something that make them feel it's worth throwing in a chip block more often than they would otherwise. Uh,
No,
yeah,
absolutely. No, yeah, I think that's fair. And that's sort of like how I was like, I'm like, I feel like part of this is how I want to know when the guy, like I want to know how a guy does when he gets chipped. But on some level, like I think I might just learn more and like how often is a guy being chipped? Like I think that can tell you so much because
mm-hmm.
about just how the league views him, especially when you have like larger samples.
yeah,
Uh,
yeah, yeah.
yeah, no, I think it's super interesting. I wanted to talk about uh double team rate. Like how would
Mm-hmm.
you use this metric to evaluate a player? Like with respect to how often they face these internal like interior double teams? Like is this one of those things where it's purely about the volume of it, or is it one of those things where you feel like there's sort of more you can sort of glean beyond that? Maybe looking at the like looking at maybe sort of run stop win rate, I think is the word I was looking for. Yeah, run stop win rate against these sort of double team
Right.
situations or things like that, where it's okay, this guy can also beat the double teams. So
Yeah. So
yeah,
I agree all the way around. It'd be interesting to look at that as like the individual player, like how often are they beating the double team, and then also how often is the team being successful when he's getting double teamed versus when he's not, right? Like
yeah,
is maybe combining the linebacker one, right? Like the blocked tackle rate or whatever, like is well, I guess it'd be a little bit of a twist on that, but like how how much less is the linebacker behind him getting blocked and it can just make a clean tackle because he's eating up a double team, right? Like and seeing how much it impacts players around him or the team as a whole as their success rate or whatever. Uh,
and it might be different play to play, right? Like sometimes like the defensive coordinator does want this interior guy to just eat up the blockers because he knows that the linebacker is going to be coming in
mm-hmm.
right behind him, and sometimes the linebacker is going to be dropping. Like is planning on dropping into coverage if it's not a run play, and you're like, he's not going to be nearly as like suited to like pulling up behind him, and it's like, no, you got to beat your double team. Don't worry about soaking them up. You actually have to get through them and try to
Mm-hmm.
get around them. So it's like I feel like it's
Right.
situation dependent too, for sure. And that's one of those things where I feel like it's like, okay, yeah, like grading it or scoring it or looking at it, you can't really know what everyone's assignments are, but neither do the other team, and
Yep.
they're the ones looking at this film all week. I think that's a Sam Monson thing.
Right.
So
Right.
it's like
Yeah.
they don't know what the assignments were either. So like I think it's fine that not everyone knows what everyone's assignment is on every play. For sure.
Exactly. There's always a degree of uncertainty there, right? Like,
Yeah. No, I wanted to kind of pivot now into like the pass rush sort of specific stuff in terms of like the styles of pass rushing. Like, is anything being charted beyond spin moves and bull rushes? Like, is there like sort of like the rip moves being like charted or a swim or anything like that? Like, are we just looking at these couple ones, or is it the kind of thing that PFF charts all these like all the different ways in which a pass rusher beats the guy across from?
so that's an interesting question as well. We have a process called all blocking where they chart every blocking interaction on a play. So it's not even just like one row of data per player per play, but per interaction. So if it could be a run play where an offensive lineman blocks a defensive lineman, and gets to the second level and blocks linebacker or DB, and that will all get charted. Or the flip side, if pass rusher beats the offensive lineman, that gets charted, and then if they get help from the running back, beat him or not, right? Like then that will also get charted. In terms of like the specific moves, I would have to look, to be entirely honest, to see,
Okay. I was just
how
curious because
specific
I was
they
like,
get
oh,
with
we
the
have these couple moves. I know there's more things like
right.
yeah.
Yeah, it's like the swim moves in there, whatever. That is an interesting question. On which moves get charted and how they get categorized. Yeah.
I think that's because I was just sort of dreaming up like a pass rush versatility model where it's like, okay, how often does he mix it up? How often is that actually helpful, or should you just be spamming the moves that work? Like it's one of those things where
Right.
I wasn't sure. But it's
Yeah, because it is interesting. It's like, okay, if a guy does a spin move like this percentage of the time, is that a good thing or not? Right? Like,
there's got to
is
be
he showing
diminishing
that that's
returns
his
in it.
only move, or is
Yeah.
he using that move so much because it works? Right? Like, yeah, it is
And there
really
has to be
interesting.
diminishing returns, right? Like it's like I noticed like
Sure.
Aiden Rodgers has like his spin rate this year, and he's like doing even better on an increased spin rate. So like he's gonna keep increasing it until he stops, or I guess not anymore because of the injury. But like he would have kept increasing it, I would think, until he stopped doing better and he would equilibrate. But like it's got to be predictable at some point. But like when is that is like such an interesting question to me. I don't know. But like more broadly, that like spin move grade, that plus minus system y'all are using there with respect to the expectation, like I was kind of curious, like is the plus minus system the same as sort of the standard grading system? And then like there's like an expected spin move grade in there that's sort of going part of it, it seems. So I guess I was curious like where that sort of expectation is coming from.
Yeah, that is a good question, and I kind of wondered the same thing when I saw that one. As like the plus minus grade, I don't. They could be. Would that be big number? Well, 84 spin moves. Maybe he might have a positive rate. That could be. Well, they can't just be summing them up because uh, they go out to two decimal places, which wouldn't be possible with grades that are only in 0.5 increments.
Yeah, good
So
take.
I'm not entirely sure exactly how they're generating the spin grade specifically, but I would imagine it's uh, has to do with something on an expectation level, like you're saying, where maybe they've just taken like the uh, pressure rate at or like pass rush win rate on spin moves in general, like league average for
Intuitively, that sounds
maybe the last
correct.
couple of
Yeah.
years or something. Like I don't know, and then just seeing if they're above that, how far above that. I don't know, but I mean there could be many ways to slice that, right? Because you can even like with our plus minus grades, the -2 to +2 scale, right? Those are you can look at those in various ways, kind of like EPA, right? Like you can look at that and take the number at its face value, or you can make it strictly like a binary thing. Like, okay, was it a good play, right? Like let's look at this as like a batting average sort of thing and say, how often are they generating plays that are putting them in a better position to score rather than, uh, you know, taking out the magnitude of the numbers, right?
Absolutely, and that makes them more stable. When you do that, I feel like when you're talking about success rate versus EPA, and it kind of just occurred to me of like, like I know it would be way less interesting to look at, but all those like adjusted EPA metrics that sort of are floating around from like the Ben Baldwins and Kevin Coles of the world, that like where
Yeah.
they're sort of trying to take out all the randomness, and it's like I kind of would be more interested in that in success rate at a certain point if we're just trying to take out all randomness. Maybe we should just also be doing success rate and not EPA at that point. Although you sort of I do think sometimes you're missing things obviously with success rate, especially with like how important explosive plays are. I feel like in the modern NFL, kind of always have been if we're being honest. But like
Mhm.
it's one of those things where you will gain more stability if you look at it that way. So it's certainly
Right. Yeah, yeah,
No, yeah,
yeah.
what
Go
do you
ahead.
think?
I was just saying it's one of those interesting things, and I mean, like from the data science perspective, like we, I don't want to say always because that's always a dangerous word. But but like
No, never say
say
always.
always. You're right. Never say always. Uh, most of the time, at least, we try to always, evaluate both things. Like in this context, we're saying like EPA versus like success rate, like positive EPA. But it could be anything, right? Like whatever that target is you're chasing, trying to look at it in multiple ways, like can never be a bad thing, right? Like just providing more context and more information, really. Like you're saying, like one will give you better perception of like stability, and one will capture things like explosive plays and give you a better sense of that. So yeah, it's
Absolutely.
one of those things.
No, until Goodhart's law comes in and you've made that metric not worthy of targeting anymore. But
Right.
yeah, no, this was such an interesting conversation. I'm so glad to have had you on. I think we talked about maybe talking about a bunch of the new metrics that have come out since we first planned this podcast. I know you guys have come out with, I'll just list them out for the audience so they can go check them out. Receiver separation percentage, separation percentage versus press coverage, lockdown percentage, which I think looks at the sort of reverse of that, advanced coverage grade, fourth down aggressiveness, reach block grade. A lot of these speak for themselves. Stunt success rate, tackle for loss rate, sideline passing grade, which I know is a Josh Allen stat, pass protection win rate. So yeah, these all seem like super interesting, and I'd love to talk about them with you further in the future. But yeah, I guess like where can everyone who's listening find these stats on the PFF website? I saw you have a landing page for them now, right?
Yeah, I believe there's a landing page. Obviously going to pff.com. And there's also like an article that I think is being continuously updated. It's just headlined "Explore PFF's New Advanced Metrics," and it kind of lists them all out there with links to all of them. And I'll give a special shout out to the fourth down aggressiveness one because that was the one I threw my hat in the ring on. It was a fun one that was kind of I guess low hanging fruit for me and something like that I could put together just to throw my hat into the ring.
I had a really
And
interesting question actually about that one. If you're the one that built it, because I was flipping through it, and it's the distinction is interesting because I just for the audience, the distinction between the fourth down aggressiveness and the fourth down sort of metrics that you commonly see, like when someone makes a bad decision, is that this isn't looking at sort of like an optimal model. It's looking at what teams have actually done in the past,
right.
right? And
Yeah,
like, I think
100%.
I wanted to ask, like, is that one of those things where you had to like build in the sort of like progression rate where like in 2011, there's like sort of an expected go for it rate that's much lower than in 2021, for example. And like, is that the kind of thing that has to be like when you're sort of shaking that out? Or is the kind of thing where you're like, no, that's the point. We're trying to sort of compare it to that.
Yeah, I
That's okay.
considered that same thing at the time of like, okay, should I adjust for time, right? Because teams are getting more uh seemingly aggressive. I like to put that caveat on there. It's like because is it actually more aggressive if it's optimal?
Yeah, it's savvy was
But
the word I would use.
savvy, I like it. And so I decided not to like adjust for season or time because of what you're talking about, right? Like let's be able to capture the fact that so many teams now are falling into those higher tiers of exceeding what you would expect based on historical standards. And so uh, that is kind of how it goes now. And so I'm sure if you looked at 2014 or something, right? Like then a bunch of those teams would probably all fall like on the lower half of the spectrum and not be seen as aggressive, even though several may have been considered aggressive at the time, right? Like,
Well, there's only, I was going to say, was Raheem wasn't coaching. And then, so is there only one coach in the NFL right now who was, oh no, there's two, and they're the two lowest on the list. Three, and they're the three lowest on the list. Sorry.
that's
There's three
interesting.
coaches who would be in your sample, and they're the three lowest coaches on the list. And I think that's amazing.
That's
Oh
really
no,
interesting. I hadn't thought
John's
that.
there. I'm sorry, John Harbaugh, but I
Well,
apologize.
but
Yeah, yeah, I
he's
forgot about John. Okay, yeah, no, that's fair, fair. Don't erase him from history. But just make sure I'm not missing anyone else before I make this point. But yeah, it does seem like most of the coaches who are like at least more conservative are just coaches who have been in the NFL when it was more conservative and they haven't fully adjusted. Like,
Right. Yeah.
and that's super interesting for sure to think about.
Yeah, that's one of the things I've thought about with this. Obviously, it's I haven't done it, and it's not out there. But like looking at this instead of at the team level, looking at the coach level, and even seeing like coach season level and seeing how individual coaches have changed throughout the year, and maybe you could identify like, oh, when they've had this team, maybe with this quarterback or this running back or whatever it is, like you can see like different dips and rises and.
Or even an optimal decision that went wrong, I feel like would be a good example of it. Or like a bad run of optimal decisions going wrong, like looking at the luck element within it of like, how does the bad luck, which it shouldn't impact in an optimal way, like
Right, yeah.
how it actually does. Like I'm thinking of Brandon Staley because I feel like he had some bad luck, got some bad press, and then sort of lost his edge with respect to that because he started being really conservative, and that is going to make you less likely to win the games, even if it didn't help you the first time to be more aggressive.
Yeah, we're getting into the Kahneman and Tversky territory now with the prospect theory, and
I will say I read Kahneman. I read exactly that all that stuff this summer, and it has changed the way I think about absolutely everything in a good way. So I can't get enough of all that cognitive bias, social behavioral economic stuff.
That's what I focused on with my master's thesis. Actually, was
no, that's awesome. I was actually
NFL,
I was saying to, I think it was Tage Seth, former PFF guy yesterday, and another one of my friends from Michigan, Jack Reinhardt, who has recorded this pod with us, just saying the other day, like, I think the the kicking stuff, like, why are teams so hesitant to kick when we can sort of see it's positive EP to kick and like kick in a way that the team returns it rather, and not just through the end zone? I think the answer is just loss aversion. It's going to hurt so much more when they actually have a good return than feel good when you get those minor gains. And even though the long run, it will be right, you don't want to deal with that. So.
A great example of that I've used is like if it's the first drive of the game, you're on offense, you get a couple first downs, stall out around like the 50-yard line and punt, and then your punter like pins them on the 1, you're gonna be like pumped, right? It's so excited. But if first drive of the game, you march all the way down to the goal line and then go for it on 4th down and get stuffed on the 1. You're putting the opposing team in the exact same situation, and it's actually even better, like from a indicative standpoint of like what's to come. Like your offense is clearly being able to move the ball against the defense, and so you actually had a better offensive possession and put the opposing team in the exact same situation to start their possession. But in one, you're going to be coming off the field disappointed, and one, you're going to come off the field like excited and pumped about it. And it's like the exact opposite of what it should be. But yeah,
and it's not even just a mindset thing. Like I think this is actually straight from Kahneman, but I think there was like the example of the professional golfers with putting where they were legitimately more successful making par putts than birdie putts from the same distance because one was avoiding a loss and one was achieving a gain, and they were more, whether that like subconscious focus, like there isn't like necessarily a great causal explanation for why loss aversion impacts people, but like the correlation is like almost undeniable. So it's like it's really, really interesting for sure. I think this is a great way to wrap up the pod. So I think this was awesome, man. I really want to thank you so much for coming on. I'm excited to hopefully have you on again sometime soon and talk about the rest of it.
Appreciate you having me.
Yeah. Is there anything you want to promote or anything you want to tease in terms of what's coming?
I mean, just like I said, thank you for having me on. This was a blast. I enjoyed talking about all this with you. It's always fun to talk football, right? And especially when I get to combine my love of numbers in football and talk about both at the same time. And this is a great way to do it. I already got to plug my 4th down aggressiveness metric there a little bit. So that was really the only promotional thing I was going to try and do here was help my cause and maybe get some more clicks on that article so I can have some leverage over my coworkers and have something to plant my flag and say, see, my metric is better, right?
Absolutely. No, I'll make sure to, whenever I share this, I'll make sure to throw the link both to the landing page and I'll throw in a specific link to the 4th down aggressive one and boost those links, boost those page views. All right. Thank you so much for coming on. Thank you everyone for listening. I hope you enjoyed this podcast, and I'll see you next week.